Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. This is Companions and Comitatus, warband culture in Northern Europe and digital games. So what is warband culture? I would define it as a common form of military organization in late antique and early medieval Northern Europe. It is based on the relationship between a chief or king and his military followers who have sworn oaths of loyalty to him. Hence the warband, or as Tacitus puts it, the comitatus. There are specific characteristics to this relationship. The followers cannot leave the chief on the battlefield. The chief must reward his followers for good service with lands or gold or goods. It is often looked upon as the origins of the feudal relationship. Is it? Well, feudalism is a tricky sort of thing to talk about because it doesn't really exist as the popular belief would have you believe it does. On the level of basic social institutions, there are some commonalities there. Now, when I say it's a common form of military organization, I mean not just the Scandinavians. We see it amongst the Germanic peoples of late antiquity, but also amongst the Scots, the Irish, and the Saxons. All of these cultures had a great deal in common, so it's not surprising there'd be similarities in military organization as well. Now, to explain where this idea came from in the first place requires talking a little bit about a book that was actually written in the 1st century CE. So Tacitus's Germania is an ethnographic work. Tacitus was a Roman historian. The most difficult thing about the Germania is that we don't really know what it was intended to accomplish. There are no other texts like it that survive from the late Roman period. So, is it one of a kind? Or is it just the only one that happened to survive? Some scholars have decided that it was clearly just research notes for Tacitus's later work, the Histories. Sometimes scholars have argued that it's a historical work, or sometimes a moral treatise. I mean, did he hate the Germanic peoples, or was he looking at them as sort of a proto-anthropologist? There's also been the argument that it's about justifying the Emperor Trajan staying on the Roman side of the frontier, or encouraging him to cross the frontier and keep conquering Germania. So it is dated to 98 CE. It's about as precise as we can get. It's important to note that Tacitus presents the information about the Germanic peoples that he has as if it's unbiased and objective. It's meant to be a senator's report, and that affects how we read it, even if we know that, of course, yes, it is biased. He was a governor near the German frontier, so he was seen as qualified to talk about the province. Now, it was lost during the Middle Ages. One copy was found in 1425 in Hersfeld Abbey's library, was brought to Italy and given to the Pope. And what happened is that it stirred an interest in the distant Germanic past that was, very in line with what Romanticism believed. The study of Tacitus in this period, especially his discussion of Germanic kingship, led to some rather unfortunate consequences, however. The Nazis loved Tacitus. They used the Germania to descend even further into this type of racial chauvinism. They would talk about how Tacitus discussed Germanic warrior culture as moral and pure, how they were bound to the land. Basically, they tied political development to the concept of race. And we all know how that ended. So the subtitle of this slide, A Most Dangerous Book, is actually the title of a book about Tacitus. It's really very interesting if you're wanting to know more. Now, of course, we also see the warband in medieval literature. And one of the places where it's most noticeable is in Beowulf, which is an Old English poem. The story, we believe, emerges sometime after the 6th century. It's in oral form originally, and is taken into written form sometime before the 11th. Just very briefly, the storyline. This focuses on the hero Beowulf of the Geats. He goes to help King Hrothgar against Grendel, who may or may not be a troll. Also winds up fighting Grendel's mother. And then many years later, after becoming king of his own people, fights a dragon who kills him. Now, young Beowulf is well served by his warband, which tries to protect him when he's fighting Grendel, although they discovered that their weapons can't actually break Grendel's skin. But they uphold their responsibility as his retainers, and the poet praises them for it. In contrast, what happens with the older Beowulf during the fight with the dragon is a sharp difference. He takes only 11 men with him to hunt the beast down. Presumably he picks these from among his best, and then orders them to wait outside while he fights the dragon. And his companions actually run away to save their own lives. The poet is obviously pretty horrified by this. They have actually failed to uphold their battle obligation to their lord and brought shame upon themselves. And so they have really not behaved to the standard expected of a warband. If you compare them to the Geats who accompanied Beowulf to Hrothgar's hall at the beginning of the poem, they are depicted as a model of unity and power, and even the sound of the poetry suggests this unified, skilled, fearsome military unit. Now, at the end of the poem, the only one of the 11 retainers who actually behaves properly is Wiglaf, who's a young warrior who winds up reproaching his comrades for their cowardice. He tries to appeal to them to go back and help Beowulf fight, and he's the only one who does. Now, he does help slay the dragon, but he's unable to prevent his lord's death, which is another failure, and something that is pretty terrible for a warband to allow to happen. While he's dying, Beowulf expresses his appreciation to Wiglaf, gives him his armor and gear, and calls him the last survivor of our lineage. The only reason Wiglaf gets this recognition is that he didn't flee. He is thus perhaps the only one fit to step into Beowulf's place after his death. When his comrades finally return, Wiglaf has some very harsh words for them. He basically tells them that they should have died, and he exiles them. He goes on to take command of those waiting in the main camp for the king's return, and he talks about what an uncertain future the Geats now face without their ruler. He did go back, and he redeemed himself by doing so, but he did run in the first place, and he also was not able to prevent Beowulf from dying. So he has failed, just not as catastrophically as the other members of the warband. All right, so a little bit about the warband and medieval history, and a little bit in literature as well. So the 10th century saw what you might call sort of second wave of the Viking Age in England. There had been some momentous changes in Denmark. Harald Bluetooth of the Jelling dynasty had begun to centralize Denmark and part of Norway. Svein, his son, who deposed him in 987, continued the process and started to attack England as well. The original suggestion is that this happens because those who were attacked were fleeing Denmark, seeking greener pastures elsewhere. But of course, most of the initial raiders likely came from the Viking settlements in the Isles, not from Scandinavia itself. By the beginning of the 11th century, however, we see whole invasion armies from Denmark as part of a greater attempt by the Danish kings to create a northern empire. But shortly before that, we have the Battle of Malden. So 991 is the arrival of one of the first invasion fleets. It may have been led by Olaf Tryggvason prior to him being king, also possibly Svein of Denmark. We're told there were 93 ships, and the battle happens just along the coastline. Now, the poem that talks about the battle is fragmentary. It's missing lines at the start and at the end. It's also not an eyewitness account, but we know that some of the events it portrays are true because they're corroborated elsewhere in Saxon sources. And one of these events is the death of Ealdorman Berthnoth. Berthnoth was the second-ranking ealdorman in the kingdom. He was an older official with ties to King Edgar's reign. King Edward was sort of the last good king. So losing Berthnoth was a huge moral blow. And the Battle of Malden, the poem talks about his retainers sort of going back and throwing themselves into battle because their lord was dead, and they might as well die alongside him because otherwise they're shamed to have lived. There are some who flee, and the supposition is that they come to a bad end because they're cowards and they flee. Now, there are some questions that come up about why the English would choose to memorialize a lost battle. And I think it's just because, Bertnoth goes out with style. He tries to fight honorably. He actually has a sort of a flighting episode with the leader of the Vikings. And he was such a colossal figure in England around that time. Another thing that comes up, so many of our literary depictions of the warband show it not working the way it should. And we have to ask ourselves why this is. Why are people always failing their lords, or why are lords failing the members of their warband? What is it about this ideal that is aspirational rather than achievable? All right, turning to the games now. The obvious connection to warband culture in Skyrim is the Companions questline. For those of you who haven't played the game, the Companions are a group of warriors you first encounter upon coming to Whiterun. They carry on the tradition of the 500 companions of Ysgramor, who was the first human ruler of Skyrim. They act as sort of a group of non-partisan mercenaries who take on contracts that serve the public good. They are based in the Mead Hall Jorvaskr, which actually resembles a Viking ship that's been capsized. It's an interesting design. You do have the option of joining them. There are numerous benefits, including the ability to train in some of the martial skills, access to their Skyforge to create high-level gear, new quests, and the ability to become a werewolf. That's not usually a warband thing. It is a medieval thing, but that's another whole topic. I will say that the whole werewolf thing does have some connection to the Viking idea of the berserker. Now, the main Companions questline involves you helping them deal with their werewolf issue and cleanse the group of their curse before they all get killed by werewolf hunters. But, setting that aside, your progress through the questline mimics the rise of a new warrior through the warband. You have to prove yourself to your shield brothers and sisters, in Skyrim's case. You have to provide service to your leader, in this case freeing him of his curse, so that he can continue after death to Sovngarde. You then rise to the position of harbinger, or leader of the companions. Obviously, it's not a perfect parallel to the warband. In some ways, the companions are almost more like knights errant. The Viking aesthetic is what makes them look like a warband. This wouldn't be the only place where it's surface level, covering something else up. Their duty to the people and the fact that they don't take a side in politics honestly makes them feel more like pseudo-knights to me. But then, there's a reason they give them this particular lore background. Ysgramor's group would have been an actual warband from the sounds of it, and it helps to the overall appeal to our taste for things Viking. Now, they actually have quite a history that's covered in in-game books that you can choose to read. It's interesting. The sheer variety of in-game literature in Skyrim has always kind of amazed me. You find out, for instance, that they often fought over Jorvaskr. They had a dishonorable period or two. And really, the companions in trying to find the best possible leader, it is very medieval warband, like, when you stop to think about it. You want to be with the person that you think is the best in the room. You want to be allied with the one who can offer you the most. Now, the companions of the present day in Skyrim model the behavior of their historical predecessors in order to keep their legacy alive. It's a really interesting interpretation of the warband, really. Now, there is not quite as clear-cut a parallel to the warband in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The longship crew is largely anonymous, with the exception of Dag, the grumpy lieutenant, and the Skald, who does the singing and storytelling when they're sailing. There are exceptions. Ivor can recruit a handful of more significant NPCs during their adventures, who can then be assigned to ship duty. These are other Vikings, obviously, some of which were quite memorable characters on their own. In most cases, though, once they're recruited and assigned, they become anonymous and voiceless, just like the rest of them. In most cases, you only see them taking part in raids and helping you open chests. There are a couple of exceptions. You do get to have an additional conversation with each of them post-recruitment, and there are also moments when you have the opportunity to speak to your friends prior to major battles, especially towards the end of the game. So for instance, you get to have additional conversations before the last arc with Finner and Vili, your old friend. The game also introduces the Vikings, who were an actual group of mercenaries from the sagas. Were they historical? Hard to say. We have no contemporary sources for their historicity, although there are some runestones and old pieces of poetry that refer to them, so it's possible. In the game, the Vikings are NPCs whose appearance you can design, and they can be recruited by other players to serve on their ships. You earn a little bit of money if they do. It's not much of a social gaming element, it's just a little bit of one, really. Now, Eivor from the beginning of the game is called Sigurd Strengr, which is a difficult term to translate. It's complementary in Old Norse. It suggests restless courage and honor, but also youth and perhaps inexperience. Sigurd, as the previous leader of the warband, seems to have close ties only with Eivor and Dag, who seems to be operating as Eivor's lieutenant somewhat unwillingly. It's interesting that Sigurd doesn't take Eivor with him on his journeys into the east. Eivor's position as adopted son or daughter of Sigurd's father may have had something to do with that, it's hard to say. He's not really a good reflection of a warband leader, Sigurd, because he's obsessed with his supposed secret divinity, and is gone for most of the game. Doesn't seem to be a very good leader when he's around. Now, when Eivor becomes Jarl or Jarl Skona of Ravensthorpe, they offer poetry at first, but then stops, and the line of dialogue is interesting because they say, "You are less mine than I am yours, and I ask of you only this, keep me honest in the times to come." This is a reflection of the reciprocity expected from the leader of a warband, and this is really important because the warband relationship does not only go one way. The members of the warband are companions, they are not minions, and the lord or the leader owes them a great deal as well. So just think about this in closing. You know, do you think that mingling romantic medievalism, so the concept of honor-bound chivalric warriors, with barbaric medievalism, the warband, works particularly well in a game like Skyrim? Is it something we'd like to see more of? Why did Assassin's Creed not explore the bonds between characters a little bit better? All right, so we'll be back with another lecture shortly. Thanks very much, guys.